Get Rich Education is brought to you by Norada Real Estate Corporate Direct and Ridge Lending Group. Cash flow real estate investors, this is Get Rich Education's Keith Weinhold. Did you know that you can finance up to 35 income properties all with one lender? Ridge Lending Group specializes in investment property loans, and they do it in almost every U.S. state. Ridge has worked with tens of thousands of real estate investors and homeowners all over the country. They've been doing this for investors for so long that at this point, they've helped more families realize their dreams of becoming real estate investors than any other mortgage lender in the country. To find out more, visit ridgelendinggroup.com.
Welcome to Get Rich Education with Keith Weinhold, giving you information and ideas on the investment that has turned more ordinary people into millionaires and billionaires than anything else, and can provide you with more wealth and happiness than you ever thought possible. Now, here's your host, investor, entrepreneur, business owner, and educator, Keith Weinhold.
Welcome to Get Rich Education. I'm your host, Keith Weinhold, and this is episode number 101. Yes, our second 100 shows, turning scarce mentalities into abundant ones. Thanks for your listenership. You help make GRE be heard in 168 world nations. And we're actually going to be speaking about a few of those nations today. How do cash flowing real estate markets become what they become? It's location, location, location. It's because of geography. Why do places become expensive places to live, and what makes a place inexpensive to live? We're going to get into that today. What is the future of energy-based economies? You know, that becomes an increasingly germane question when the price of a barrel of oil is depressed. You're going to get answers today. My wife and I are in Tacoma, Washington, near Seattle. And speaking of geography, if you haven't spent much time traveling in this part of the country, you might think that's relatively close to my hometown of Anchorage, but that is a 1,500-mile flight. It's a flight of 3+ hours to get from Anchorage to Seattle. And then there's a drive down here, and there's zero business purpose to this trip at all. We are river rafting. We're enjoying some pick-your-own fruits. And next, we plan to check out some hikes and some beaches on the Olympic Peninsula. Having passive income enables you to do a lot of these sorts of things. Well, Peter Zeihan, today's guest, and I plan to discuss some of the best U.S. states for where the economy will prosper and a lot more. That's probably where you want to be investing in real estate. Let's meet the incomparable Peter Zeihan. Today's guest is a geopolitical strategist and a demographic and global energy expert. His breakdown of geography and populations, they give a deep understanding of how global politics impacts markets and economic trends, and he has a keen eye on what is going to drive tomorrow's headlines. He's worked with the D.C. think tank community, the U.S. State Department in Australia, all the way to helping develop the analytical models for Stratfor, one of the world's premier private intelligence companies. In 2012, he founded his own firm, Zeihan on Geopolitics, to serve clients in the energy majors, financial institutions, business and agricultural interests, universities, and even the U.S. military. His popular and provocative book is titled The Accidental Superpower, and that book's subtitled The Next Generation of American Preeminence and the Coming Global Disorder. That book debuted in 2014. His latest project, Shale New World, will be released later this year. Welcome to Get Rich Education, Peter Zeihan.
Pleasure to be here.
So, Peter, a lot of people have long found it, I guess, popular, even within our own country here, the United States, to project the downfall of the United States, whether it's profligate central bank monetary policy or the decline of the American family or even a crumbling infrastructure, as some point to. But your book, The Accidental Superpower, tell me if I'm wrong, I think it really maybe plays into some sense of American exceptionalism. Tell us about that.
Actually, the United States is still growing up as a country. We're not. It's not just that we're very young, only 200 years old, but we're still growing into the space that we have here. What really sets the United States apart from the rest of the world is a triple factor. First of all, you've got the American Midwest, which is the most productive chunk of arable land in the world and the largest. Second, directly overlaying the greater Midwest is the Mississippi River system. The advantage of rivers is pretty straightforward. Moving things around from A to B on land is expensive, but if you float it, it's only 1/12 the cost. And the greater Mississippi system alone is 13,000 miles of navigable waterway, and that is more than the rest of the planet put together. You put it directly on top of the Midwest, and it means that the United States is condemned to being a financial, agricultural, and industrial superpower, no matter who rules the country. And then third, we've got the best buffers in the world. We've got giant lakes and forests to the north, deserts and mountains to the south, and ocean moats on either side. The United States is not just the richest, it's the most secure piece of territory on the planet, and it's got one of the lowest population densities. So we can easily support a population that's double what we have currently, and we're already the world's most powerful country. Imagine how that's going to evolve over the next century.
Yeah, you take a look at our population, 320 million, but you think about that in a global sense, and our population density is not that high. And one thing that contributes to markets and developing markets is transportation and trade. And you mentioned rivers and the importance of rivers. And I think a lot of it is because the United States, I think will tell us, we really have the right type of rivers. We have navigable waters. We have rivers like the Delaware River, the Hudson River, the Susquehanna River, the Mississippi River, really great American rivers that are navigable, that are deep, that don't have a lot of rapids or rocks. And that kind of sounds like a funny thing to talk about when we're talking about real estate investing here, but rivers and trade, that develops commerce, and that really helps develop thriving markets.
Absolutely. The key factor that makes it work is navigability, because it turns every navigable river that we have into, in essence, a giant free highway. Cities tend to form among junction points in rivers that are navigable and at the deltas and at the heads of navigation. So every river system has built in at least 3 major urban areas with low-cost transport options. One of the fun things about navigable rivers is they tend to flow only through relatively flat zones. That allows for horizontal development instead of vertical development, except for those 3 nodes where people are going to try to cram into the most valuable pieces. So the United States has a variety of landscapes and a variety of urban areas, all of which are able to generate their own unique economic profile and their own unique real estate profile. So there's places for people to start businesses or start families at any part of the economic spectrum in upwards of 100 different locations in just one country. That just doesn't happen anywhere else on the planet.
We're on rivers. Let's talk about the Mississippi River for a moment, an incredibly powerful waterway. Most people don't realize the Mississippi River Drainage Basin, which is the term for the geographic area that's drained by one river, that stretches as far northeast as New York State and as far northwest as Idaho. That all drains down through Mississippi, just lending to this great power and this great navigability. And, interestingly, a couple of the most profitable cash flowing real estate markets in the United States are on the Mississippi River. Number one is Memphis, which has long been noted as one of the best cap rate markets there is, and St. Louis is another one. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that there is a low cost of living in these places. So an out-of-state investor can purchase a property in Memphis or St. Louis for a relatively low purchase price. Yet a lot of these distribution jobs that are tied to this geography are the types of jobs that allow someone to pay the rent, but maybe not be a homeowner. So it's really a lot of this geography in the Mississippi River that leads to these great cash flowing markets.
I would add that you've got a number of other urban centers that are really starting to reinvent themselves. One of the things that we've seen in the post-Cold War era is that the Americans are starting to lose interest with trade with the wider world. One of many factors that is leading to a reindustrialization of large portions of the country. One of the characteristics of the coasts is because they only have one coast as opposed to a river that has 2, you are more likely to have high property values that tend to price folks out. That's one of the many reasons why places like Miami and New York and San Francisco have become so expensive, whereas Chicago and St. Louis and New Orleans are considerably less so. So when this reindustrialization process kicks in, it tends to favor the interior of the country for land cost reasons, for labor cost reasons, for input reasons, and for distribution reasons. And so we're seeing places like Greater Chicagoland start to really become a major industrial core. Kentucky on the Ohio now has the world's largest Toyota plant. And I think this is just the leading edge for across this entire region becoming something that would probably recognize more likely as 1950s and 1960s America instead of 1990s and 2000s America.
Yeah, this is really interesting. And I'm enjoying this, Peter. I'm finally getting to use my geography degree for less than 1 hour, 1 week of my life. I've heard you talk about the notion, and it sounds sort of paradoxical, the fact that the United States, we are an isolated economy, but yet we have a certain degree of integration that plays into that isolation. Can you talk to that between isolation and integration and us having just the right elements to be a prosperous economy in the United States?
Well, the United States is continental in size, so it can achieve within its borders economies of scale that most of the rest of the world requires a global connection to make happen. A great example in terms of relative wealth and relative population is the comparison between the United States and the European Union. Formation of the European Union started in the late 1940s, and it has taken them until today to achieve roughly the degree of economic integration among the members that the United States had in 1850. It's a long time going when you have countries that get in the way. The United States has been all one system the whole time, and so has been the largest economy in the world for roughly 160 years. No sign that that's going to change anytime soon.
When I think of Europe, I think of a geography that has a more sort of cultural departmentalization, and I think of the United States as being more culturally integrated. Is that part of it?
Oh, that's absolutely part of it, and it comes back to the rivers. In the United States, most of our river systems feed into the greater Mississippi, and even those that don't are part of the intercoastal waterway network, which is connected to the Mississippi. So you can sail from Pittsburgh to Chicago to St. Louis to New Orleans to Miami to Washington, D.C., really on the same maritime system. When everybody's in the same boat, somewhat literally, you get a degree of cultural homogenization. You don't have that in Europe. In Europe, very few of the rivers connect at all, and they all flow to different seas, whether it's the North Sea, the Baltic Sea, the Adriatic, the Black Sea, you name it. And so in the United States, the rivers are kind of communal property. They're a unifying factor. In Europe, they're national ownership. There's French rivers, there's German rivers, there's Austrian rivers, there's Dutch rivers. And so the nationality kind of clings to this one river system. It's their base of power, and it enables them to stand up to each other. We've never had that in the United States.
Yeah, this is so interesting. When a lot of people think of transportation here, where we are well into the 21st century, Peter, I think a lot of people think of goods flying around on airplanes, but yet a lot of it, including a lot of the big items, they are still transported on rivers. For goodness sake, when you buy something on Amazon, it's actually called shipping. It's called shipping, like something that's moved on a ship. That's a term in our everyday nomenclature, but yet we just still don't really make that synonymous, trade with shipping, but that's still how a lot of stuff is moved.
There's a couple things to keep in mind. First of all, the economic and cultural experiences of a country's first century, century and a half tend to shape how it sees the world. For the United States, it's always been about integration and water transport. So when you have the cultural unification that comes right off the beginning, it's set a pattern that survives despite technological change. And second, you're absolutely right. Roughly 1/4 of U.S. ton miles is still shipped by water. And if we had a couple of tweaks to our laws, that would probably increase to 50% within a decade.
Yeah, so besides just shipping goods, and you already touched on it somewhat, is rivers enable the diffusion of ideas and innovation, not just goods. Tell us about that.
It comes down to how easy it is for people to interact. One of the things that we've seen in the United States is whenever we do have a technological or cultural shift, the speed at which those changes disseminate through the system is radically quick compared to most of their global equivalents. So, for example, when the cell phone kicked in, you'd see it first in places like New York and San Francisco, but we had 95% penetration in less than a decade. You have something like that in, say, China. When the cell phone hit China, it popped up in the southern coastal cities like Hong Kong and Fujian very quickly, and then it shot up the Yangtze River all the way to Sichuan. But in the northern core, which is flat and open and unrivered, the Beijing area, it took quite a bit longer. It allows for a degree of cultural unification that you just don't see in most other places. And this happens with politics every bit as much as it happens with technology. The core reason that we have a red-blue split is that the majority of the blue states are in areas where transport is even easier. They tend to be the more urbanized area, whereas the red states tend to be in places that are a lot more rural, and so find the transport between their communities a little bit more difficult.
That is a super interesting way to think about that. I had never thought about that in those terms before. And You touched on technology somewhat, and people think geography doesn't matter much anymore. Well, I contend that geography's always mattered, and it still matters significantly, even in an era of rapid technological change. You mentioned cell phones. Another thing that can affect trade and supply chains is that of kind of the advent, and we'll see more use of 3D printing if we get a user-friendly interface. And 3D printing can have drastic effects on supply chains and energy use and so on. What do you see 3D printing doing to geography and the geography of distribution specifically?
3D printing is a technology that allows you to use something that looks a lot like a dot matrix printer to build up layers of material until you get a three-dimensional object. It's considerably slower than traditional die-cast manufacturing, but it allows for ultimate customization because all you have to do is load in the program and it gets going. You don't have to make the cast in the first place. So if you're doing a print run of roughly 500 copies or less, 3D printing is typically more economically viable. It's only with the large scale stuff that it still makes sense to go with the old style. The advantages of 3D printing are still being explored because it's a relatively new technology. It's got limitations. It requires a different sort of input. It requires a lot more software engineering per unit than you have with a more traditional production processes. But we do know so far is that it's starting to advance almost along the lines of Moore's law. That 500 unit minimum is now probably, just in the last 3 years, increased to about 2,500. The printing time has dropped by a factor of almost 90%. And what we're seeing now is the development of printers that can put upwards of 6 different materials into the same print run. So you can get a complex part with moving sections that normally would require multiple industrial processes to generate and then final assembly. End result is you're getting a cost reduction in various pieces of the manufacturing process. Now, in a system that we have today with multiple steps, supply chain, sometimes thousands of steps, you can take some of the more complex chunks of that and simply print out the piece and carve out 5, 10, 15% of the process. This has a number of different implications. First of all, it tends to favor countries that have rock-solid power grids, good input costs, and local distribution systems. The United States tends to win on all 3 of those factors. Second, it collapses the supply chain. So instead of thousands of steps, you go down to hundreds or maybe even dozens of steps. That means you want to locate your printing and your manufacturing process as close to the end customer as possible. Once again, the United States is the largest economy in the world, and it's really the only advanced growing market in the world these days. So this technology and others like it are clawing back huge amounts of manufacturing capacity to the United States, and that's before you consider the changes to the international system.
Yeah, that's right. Some have favored 3D printing here in the United States rather than sort of the offshoring movement that we've seen in manufacturing for the past generation as the opportunity to reshore a lot of our production right here in the United States and kind of putting an end to the made in China era.
Absolutely. And there's a couple other things that are dovetailing with that very nicely. The first one is the Shale Revolution. 3D printing and a lot of manufacturing processes are incredibly energy and input intensive. Well, the break-even price in the big 4 shale fields is now just over $40 a barrel. So U.S. energy production is local, it's relatively risk-free from a geopolitical point of view, and it's keeping electricity prices at the lowest in the world, aside from the countries that subsidize electricity. So that's pushing a lot of things back to the United States. Second, we're seeing the international system destabilize. The United States created the free trade era back in the late 1940s in order to basically bribe up an alliance. We told everybody that if they were part of this global whole that we would manage, that we would defend them. That's the basis, for example, of the NATO alliance. Fast forward 70 years to the 2016 presidential cycle, and we now have had 23 of the 24 candidates being populist and campaigning against free trade. The 2 that ultimately got the nomination are talking about basically doing away with the free trade era, although they'll use different terminologies and different time frames. If you are an international supplier that's part of these multi-step supply chains, you just saw every step of your process become riskier and more expensive. But if you're located back in North America, it's safe, it's risk-free, the energy is abundant, and you're behind the tariff wall. And so we are seeing the beginning of a massive reshoring and onshoring process as American manufacturers bring their manufacturing processes home. and as foreign manufacturers try to position as much of their supply chain system within the United States, Canada, and Mexico as they possibly can.
Well, this intersects with supply chains and distribution and the viability of economies. And one thing that 3D printing is going to change, regardless of the degree that it's embraced, is the use of energy. And we still propel a lot of our energy through oil and petrol. So, what do you see as the future viability of oil, especially as 3D printing potentially erodes the need for oil? Maybe less stuff would need to be shipped.
There's a couple different angles that you can apply shale to the 3D printing revolution. The first and most obvious is that if the product is produced in a few local steps as opposed to dozens and hundreds of international steps, the amount of energy that is required to ship the product is reduced. Most shipping is done via diesel, bunker fuel, or gasoline, via truck, train, or ship. You remove 40,000 miles from the ultimate product chain shipping, and you've collapsed the amount of oil that is absolutely needed in the United States for production. It's pretty straightforward. Second, and less obvious, is in the United States, natural gas is a byproduct from a lot of these shale fields. And so there's a big challenge in building the pipe networks necessary to capture all this waste gas and funnel it in the system. Well, if natural gas is a waste product of the United States, it's really cheap. In fact, U.S. natural gas prices have been below about $4 now for 6 years, which is less than half the global average. This makes electricity really cheap in the United States, cheapest in the world. And the primary input, aside from software engineers, for the 3D printing revolution is electricity. It's taken care of here.
We're talking about distribution and future changes to it, how that shapes geography, how that shapes economics, and how that shapes where the future best real estate markets might be. You're listening to Get Rich Education. Our guest is Peter Zeihan. More when we come back. I'm your host, Keith Weinhold.
Garrett Sutton here, Robert Kiyosaki's asset protection attorney and the author of Loopholes of Real Estate. As an American or foreign-based investor in U.S. real estate, you know we are a litigious society. You know that you need to protect your real estate and paper asset holdings with the right mix of LLCs and corporations. My firm, Corporate Direct, not only forms these entities, but importantly, we properly maintain them too. If you fail to follow the corporate formalities, you can lose it all in an instant. Corporate Direct is your source for LLC protection and maintenance in all 50 states. Visit corporatedirect.com or call 800-600-1760. Mention Get Rich Education for a free bonus. Switch your resident agent service to us and receive another bonus. It's all good. We look forward to assisting you at corporatedirect.com.
Are you having a hard time finding great investment properties? Unfortunately, the best deals are rarely found locally. Successful investing begins with the right properties in the right markets. Norada Real Estate provides everything you need to invest in the best deals across the U.S. Our simple, proven system will help you create real wealth and passive monthly cash flow. Get your free copy of the ultimate guide to passive real estate investing at noradarealestate.com/guide. That's NORADA realestate.com/guide.
This is Rich Dad Advisor Ken McElroy. Listen to Get Rich Education with Keith Weinhold and don't quit your daydream.
Welcome back to Get Rich Education with our guest, Peter Zeihan, Zeihan.com, Zeihan.com. Peter, we've talked a bit about oil, and that's often been such a valuable driver of business and jobs for the long term. And I know a lot of people, at least in the recent past, have chosen to invest in real estate in energy markets. And I think we've since seen that the price can be awfully volatile, and that can be more precarious than some think. But I think just in a general sense, when we look at energy sources, is oil and the petro industry, is that going to continue to be a long-term viable solution for our energy needs in the United States and elsewhere?
As a green, it hurts me a little bit to say this, but there's nothing about the technologies that exist in alternate energy right now that are applicable across a wide swath of geographies. Solar just doesn't have the energy density that's required just yet, and the battery systems that are currently under development have already shown that their maximum capacity is not enough to give us the sort of city storage that would be required to move away from oil and natural gas and fossil fuels in general on a reasonable time frame at a reasonable cost. In fact, it's probably not even technically possible at all. Does that mean you shouldn't even consider solar panels? Of course not. I live in Texas, peak demand and peak supply match up where I live perfectly, so I've got a 6 kilowatt system on my roof. I also drive a Prius. But getting something that can move an entire country's economy away from fossil fuels, we're just not there yet. As for the volume of crude that's available, there's a little quirk of law with the SEC that says that you have to report your known reserves. It's part of how people value the stock of their companies. But one of the unofficial rules within the energy sector is that if you report more than 30 years of reserves, everyone assumes that you're not doing enough to exploit them. So I've identified yourself as a takeover target. So we have now, for 50 years, had American companies that have 30 years of reserves remaining. I don't see any reason for that to change anytime soon. So the volume of crude available really isn't an issue. And the cost of what's available, because the shale revolution continues to come down. So until the technologies of alternative fuels really goes through a quantum leap in evolution, we're stuck in the oil era for at least the next 3 or 4 decades.
Right. With the United States not just having a lot of shale, but having great access to shale, of course, that changes a lot of things. For example, Russia has a lot of shale, but it's almost all locked under permafrost. So here in the United States, we have shale and we actually have access to it. Over the long term, just looking at your crystal ball, do you think that's going to continue to put downward pressure on the price of a barrel of oil?
In the United States, certainly. I think we now have a functional floor in the United States for crude of probably between $60 and $80 a barrel. So there's no going back to what the shale operators considered the heyday being of 2 to 6 years ago. But that doesn't necessarily mean that that is what will happen with global energy prices. As the United States backs away from the international system, as you get this country that made it all happen lose interest, countries, whether it's France or China, are going to start to pick up the slack and try to assert power over their own peripheries. That is going to lead to a regeneration of the old imperial model, where any country that can control the waterways around them could really impose an economic reality. That leads to a breakup of the global system. And the commodity that is traded most aggressively across international borders by water is oil. So we will have conflicts, regional and trans-regional, over oil production, oil transport, oil distribution, oil consumption that North America is, for the most part, is immune to. So you can have shortages because of wars in Ukraine or Russia or Iran or China or Japan or Saudi Arabia that disrupt global petroleum distribution, driving prices to $200 a barrel and up that don't affect the United States at all. You'll have a split in the oil price between global prices, which are high and erratic, and domestic prices, which are low and calm.
That would be really interesting. That would affect a lot of things. Where the United States typically has oil prices based currently in West Texas Intermediate crude, they might still use that as a benchmark, and you're projecting there could potentially be a disparity, and then there'd be a world price or a price in another continent.
Right. In the United States, you would probably have a re-benchmarking to something that some folks have started to call Houston Light Sweet, because the crude that's coming out of the Eagle Ford, the Barnett, and the Permian is a much higher quality and a much larger collective stream than what we have traditionally. So you might have some re-benchmarking issues there. But for globally, there is no global benchmark that makes sense once you start to interrupt regional crude supplies, because Urals out of Russia is going to be disrupted. The Saudi Arabian streams are going to be disrupted. And by the time you get to East Asia, there's just not enough crude left to supply all of the Northeast Asians. So the Koreans, the Taiwanese, the Japanese, and the Chinese have to basically scrap over what's left. So you're going to have this shattering of international oil markets. The concept of transcontinental arbitrage is just going to vanish because it won't be safe. None of that affects North America.
Well, it's such an interesting thing to think about in a large sense, because with more technology and innovation, the growing premise is that the world becomes more and more globalized. However, in this paradigm, we're talking about something becoming more fractured.
Globalization requires an overarching military power that doesn't have a vested interest in the day-to-day economic comings and goings of the world. And since 1944, that has been the United States. We created Bretton Woods. We created the World Trade Organization. We created GATT and free trade in general in order to elevate all of our Cold War allies to a position where they would be willing to be the front line against the Soviet Union. It worked beautifully. The best part of it is it allowed us to expand that network from its original membership base of the Western European countries to more and more countries as the decades rolled by, until we eventually got most of the developing world, China included. That's the origin of the Sino-Soviet split, by the way. It worked perfectly. But that time has passed. And never forget that for the United States, Bretton Woods free trade, it was never an economic program for us. It was a security program. It was a bribe. And so as a percentage of GDP, the United States is the least involved economy in the world in international trade. And so the United States can walk away from this system and not suffer much in the way of ill effects. Whereas other countries, the Japanese, the Chinese, the Koreans, the Germans, the Italians, they've bet the farm on the continuation of this program. So when the United States does step back, the global system in its current form will just dissolve.
Yeah, well, the United States, we certainly have a greater degree of self-sufficiency than most nations in the world, and we've been talking about a lot of reasons why. So that degree of globalization, that has a lot of economic effects. Greater globalization is something that flattens wages and is a deflationary force. We talk potentially about the price of a barrel of oil being low in the United States over the longer term. That's another deflationary force. And what do you think? Do you see more deflation or more inflation? There are potentially some deflationary forces out there, but the United States Central Bank, there's pretty much no limit to the amount that they can print to try to stay on top of deflation and meet their inflation target. What do you see happening with geopolitics and inflation versus deflation, especially in the United States?
There's a lot of factors going in both directions. When you're talking about just baseline inflation versus deflation, the single largest factor almost always is the balance between production and consumption. And when it comes to consumption, demography is the key issue. How many people do you have that are actually buying things? And are they of a population cohort that tends to be very consumption oriented? Now, the demographic that tends to buy the most stuff are your young workers, people roughly aged 20 to 45. The United States has the largest cadre in that class in the world that is of middle class or higher. And of all of the countries in the world that are advanced, there are only 4 in which that population cohort is stable or growing. And the United States has more in that cohort than everybody else put together. So in the United States, we do have a mild inflationary pulse, specifically from our demographic structure. And that's the demographic structure that generates the labor to make the production in the first place, and it's tomorrow's taxpayers. Now, you move into the rest of the world, whether you're talking about Germany or Japan or China or Canada, and that 20, 30-something group is being thinned out. It's like the rest of the world stopped having kids in the 1970s or 1980s. And so you are seeing this imbalance between production and consumption, because all those mature workers that they have in their 40s and 50s and early 60s are generating all these goods, but they don't have anybody in their 20s and their 30s to buy them. So they're even more dependent upon exports than they would otherwise. So when this breakdown happens in the world, the United States has a rough balance between its productive and its consumptive capacity. But the rest of the world doesn't have the consumption capacity, but they have too much production. So you will have, at best, a Great Depression-style imbalance in most of the world, where, again, the United States just sails on as if nothing had happened.
Yeah, it seems like we sure are covered on a lot of bases. Well, you talk about demography a little bit and aging populations in a lot of advanced places, and this intersects so well with our geography. And that brings up the case of Japan. You know, we had Harry Dent on our show recently, a prominent economist and author, talking about Japan and will the United States become the next Japan as our population ages? I think you've given a lot of reasons for why it likely won't. One interesting thing about Japan and their aging population and seeing what happens to them, and just as a reminder here, as recently as the 1980s, you know, people were projecting that Japan was going to kind of take over the world. But in any case, Japan, despite if you look at the map and look at their relative isolation, you know, you see a bunch of small islands kind of on the periphery of a continent. And additionally, Japan, they're an economy that grew up without having any significant natural resources. So how did Japan get to where it is?
Let me start by saying we're not going to become Japan. Let me make this very clear. The United States is aging. We know about the baby boomer bulge and all of the financial problems that will cause. That is real. We should be concerned about that. But because we have Generation Y, because we have the millennials, the United States is actually aging at the slowest rate of any country in the world right now.
Interesting.
So by 2019, the average American will be younger than the average Chinese. We're already younger than the average Japanese, Korean, German, Frenchman, Brit, and so on. And by 2040, Americans will actually be younger than Brazilians.
Now, a lot of that's due to migration, right?
Immigration certainly helps, but our birth rate here in the United States among the native, if you want to use a really loaded term, among the native population is the highest in the world. So the United States population structure is aging, but it's aging very slowly, very gracefully. Everyone else is aging into mass old folks' homes very, very rapidly, even in the developing world. So you don't have to worry about the United States becoming Japan from demographic reasons. Now, talking about the cultural shifts and the financial structure and the geography of Japan, that's a whole different story, which, in my opinion, is one of the most fascinating stories that geopolitics has to tell. So, as you noted, Japan's islands are relatively small. They're very mountainous. There's not a lot of flat land. In fact, if you take the entirety of the land in Japan that you can build on, you only get a chunk of territory about the same size as the U.S. state of Maryland, but 140 million people live on it. So you've got this huge imbalance right from the get-go that is completely alien to the American experience. There are few resources in Japan. So if Japan is ever to be economically successful, what they have to do is scrape together the total savings of the entire citizenry, put them in a pot, and use that to fund the development of a navy that can go out to the wider world, find raw materials, bring them home, and then use what's left over of that capital to build a manufacturing base that can process those materials. When they do that, there's not a lot of money left over, so then that same navy has to go out as a merchant marine and force the sale of these products in the wider world. It's a very debt-heavy, debt-driven economic development strategy, but it has allowed Japan to be the predominant power of the East Asian Rim for most of the last several hundred years. There's a problem with it, though, and it's the debt. Because if every step of your economic development model is driven by debt, eventually bad debts build up until the point that they absorb all available capital and your system comes crashing down. The question is, how do you deal with that? In Japan, they've got a term that they call tokusai, which roughly translates into debt forgiveness by order of the emperor. So when the debts become too much, the emperor goes out, waves around his fabulous scepter, and every debt in the country is dissolved, and they start over. Granted, there's a 3-day orgy of violence that immediately follows where everybody goes out and kills their banker just to be sure.
Exactly.
Japan today has a national debt that once you stack it up with pension arrears and local debt is in excess of 500% of GDP. They're nearing the break point right now. Now, they've done this tokusai about a dozen times in their history. They're due.
Well, your popular book, it really states country by country kind of which economy is going to prosper in the future and which one is going to be in bad shape and is destined to fail. Where is Japan in that list? What's your outlook for Japan?
Japan certainly has a demographic crisis and a financial crisis coming. They're the oldest and fastest aging society in the world. Things are getting very painful for them right now, and they are due for a full-on reset. The question is what happens to them politically. You remove the American protection, you remove the global trade, and Japan, who sees this coming, has already started repositioning most of their industrial base outside of the country and near sources of end consumption. That's one of the reasons why Japan is the top investor in the United States. It's all about capital flight and establishing economic linkages that will allow payments to come back home. That's their way of paying for mass retirement.
Well, let me just rattle off the names of a few countries, and if you could just quickly give me whether this country is going to be prosperous in the future due to geography, demography, and other factors or not. China.
Okay. China, breakdown and civil war.
Mexico.
It will be the world's second or third fastest growing economy for the next half century.
Wow. Canada. Canada's got some demographic challenges.
There is a very real risk that Canada as a country will break up.
Germany.
Germany faces the greatest strategic threats to its existence that it has since 1945.
Argentina.
Argentina is the great surprise. Even if they continue to do everything wrong, the world is their oyster.
What about Brazil? We just had the Olympics there.
Brazil's cities are all up against cliffs. It has no hinterland. Brazil can only succeed in a world where capital is cheap and international trade is robust, and that world is going away.
Russia.
Russia is aging into oblivion, and that's before you can figure in the fact that it's relatively diseased. The only way that Russia can survive is if it forward positions its military. Our Ukraine invasion is really just step one.
Let's stick in that same part of the world with what I consider sort of Eurasia's breadbasket, the Ukraine.
Ukraine doesn't have any defensible borders except one. And from the Russian point of view, Ukraine's inclusion is absolutely critical if you're going to keep the Russian population alive. Ukraine has no friends, it has no allies, and it has a superior power who covets its lands. I would not bet on Ukraine's future lasting more than another 3 or 4 years.
Now, I know there's one Central Asian country that I think where I've read that you see its outlook is quite strong, and that's Uzbekistan. Tell us why.
Uzbekistan's population core is basically in the middle of a flat pancake, and they're going to expand like syrup until they reach zones that they can't press past. The only thing that is possibly constraining Uzbekistan's expansion is the Russian presence, and so it's all about timing here. The Uzbeks have to move before the Aral Sea's desiccation spreads to the rivers, and they just simply die of thirst. But they want to wait until the Russians are so committed to war on their western periphery that the Russians can't intervene in Central Asia. So you've got these two massive expansionary powers that are kind of eyeing each other, daring the other one to go first.
Yeah, it's just super interesting to discuss. Any other countries that you think that are notable before we leave that discussion?
I'd like to talk a little bit more about Mexico.
Okay.
Mexico's got a lot going for it. It's got a stable demography. It's got cheap labor costs, which encourage foreign direct investment. It has access to the American market via NAFTA, and NAFTA is completely separate from global trade. So the United States can let global trade drop and still have access to the Mexican system and vice versa. And the drug war has actually done wonders for the Mexican system because it's kept labor costs down. As long as those labor costs are low, you don't have to worry too much about the FDI losing interest. And then finally, the Shale Revolution. The United States is exporting a lot of that excess shale natural gas to Mexico, which is allowing the Mexican industrial base to have a reliable source of power. So all the inputs that you need, the strategic environment, are perfect for Mexico and will be for at least the next 30 years.
Yeah, it's got to be paradoxical to some people that you have this long border, speaking of geography, between Mexico and the United States, yet you have such a difference in prosperity between the two countries.
Well, Mexico is highland and upland. Most of the population lives above a vertical mile, and that has retarded Mexico's development for most of its history ever since it got independence in the early 1800s. But it's immediately next door to the world's largest financial and consuming power. So Mexico has basically hitched its future to the American star, and it's doing very well because of it.
Well, then can another country in the world be like the United States?
No, there's no other place out there that has a big chunk of arable land overlaid by the waterways. The United States just has such a head and shoulders advantage in its physical geography when it got started. The country that is closest is one you mentioned earlier, Argentina. The world's fourth largest chunk of arable land with the world's third largest system of interconnected waterways. And as they come out of this statist, Peronist policy network, they're discovering that economic growth is pretty easy to come by. And if the world goes the direction that I'm anticipating, where rule of law breaks down, where finance is hard to secure, where trade is difficult, Argentina has already had 15 years of hands-on experience in that sort of world. So one way or the other, Argentina's future looks pretty bright.
All right. Well, we're talking about if any other country can be like the United States. I just wrapping up here, Peter, with the United States and us as being interested real estate investors, we want to know what economies are going to be prosperous. That leads to greater rental occupancy. That leads to appreciation in property and all sorts of positive things for an investor. Now that we have gotten back inside our own borders to kind of wind down this discussion, where within the United States do you see as being the most prosperous geographies and why?
Well, there's three categories that I think you need to look at. And of course, wherever those three categories overlap or where the best options are. So first of all, you want to look for places that have strong demographic growth because they're going to be consumption-led. And as you have all this industry reshoring to the United States, they are the places that manufacturers are going to look at very hard. The states that have the best population growth in the country are in the greater Midwest and down through the Great Plains into Texas. That's the youngest parts of the country. So anything in that zone, where it's Chicago or Houston or anything in between, looks pretty good.
Yeah.
Second, you want to look at the places that have a policy right, places that realize that there's change going on in the international system and are very aggressive at going out and mating their local geography, their local systems with whatever it is that the foreigner wants. The Midwest is a little bit further behind on this. Texas looks great on this and is very aggressive at recruiting companies. But there are a lot of places of the deep South, Alabama in particular, that has a good river system, has a good port in Mobile, and has been very aggressive at putting together all of its local leaders and representatives of everything from power companies to local tax officials and going to Germany or Korea and making contact with big companies and then providing packages that makes them very attractive for them to relocate. So it's Alabama, not New York, not California. Alabama is the number one state in the country for per capita FDI. They've just done everything right. And then third, you've got capital flight. As the global system breaks down, we're now in a world where there's no alternative to the US dollar as the global currency. So if you are in China or Japan or Germany or France and you want to get money somewhere safe, your options are the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, and the United States, which the United States may, of course, be greatest sink more than the others put together. That money is flowing in. It is looking for a place with strong rule of law where people can actually own a physical asset. And that has pushed up real estate investment into the 5 gateway cities to just ridiculous levels. So Santa Barbara, San Francisco, New York, Miami, and Seattle being the 5 gateway cities, which have seen the biggest appreciations in property price. Now, the advantage that the United States has is it has something beyond these gateway cities. So you're also seeing the money flow into the next level of cities down, whether that's Chicago or Houston or Dallas or Salt Lake City or Denver and so on. Places where these 3 factors overlap, number one is Texas. Because not only is it now a secondary gateway city, not only does it have the policy right, not only does it have the demography right, it is the number one state for investment with and trade with Mexico. So everything that is working for the United States right now, all of the factors are in place in Texas right now and will be for at least another generation.
Yeah, and all of its business tax incentives are really driving some significant in-migration in Texas. And those are really interesting comments about Alabama as well. Birmingham, Alabama is known as a cash flow real estate market as it is. So, well, Peter, this has been super interesting stuff. And I think we've been all over the map, I'll say, in both a figurative sense and almost a literal sense, too, as I've just kind of got this stream of consciousness thoughts with what I'm asking you, because you're just so interesting to speak with. Just finally, Peter, is there anything that I should have asked you about, but that I did not ask you about geopolitics and geography as it relates to real estate?
Oh, it's a big world. There's a lot going on, and we are at the biggest period of change globally and in the United States in our lifetimes. And it's going to set the stage for what happens for the next decade and the next century. If you want to read out more, The Accidental Superpower is out in stores right now. It covers the breakdown of the global system and what's going to happen next.
Well, being a savvy investor is knowing what's coming next. In a sense, I don't know of anyone that's more on top of these trends in a more broader sense than Peter Zeihan. So you can check out his website at Zeihan.com. That's Zeihan. Peter Zeihan, thanks so much for coming on to Get Rich Education.
My pleasure.
Well, yeah, few times do I find a show more interesting than this. I do have that geography degree, so that has been a long-time interest of mine. And it's really about time that we specifically discussed geography and its link with real estate investing, since the two are so closely tied together. I kind of feel like you and I just traveled around the world like twice with Peter together there. That was awesome. What a sharp, connected guy. Maybe I'll ask Peter if he'd like to come back and break down U.S. states state by state by their future economic outlook, much like we did for some world countries today. Geopolitics, it's that influence of geography, economics, and demography, and learning how that can help you make better choices as a real estate investor. Peter's book is The Accidental Superpower, The Next Generation of American Preeminence and the Coming Global Disorder. Check out all of Peter's resources again at Zeihan.com. That's Zeihan.com. Signing off from Tacoma, Washington today, I'm your host, Keith Weinhold. Though you might quit your day job, don't quit your daydream.
You've been listening to Get Rich Education, telling you what the wealthy won't tell you about real estate and investing.
Nothing on this show should be considered specific, personal, or professional advice. Please consult an appropriate tax, legal, real estate, financial, or business professional for individualized advice. Opinions of guests are their own. Information is not guaranteed. All investment strategies have the potential for profit or loss. The host is operating on behalf of Get Rich Education, LLC exclusively.
cash flow real estate investors nationwide and worldwide. This is Get Rich Education's Keith Weinhold. Forbes has rated Memphis, Tennessee as the #1 cash flowing market in the world. Our good friends at Mid-South Homebuyers have been Memphis's premier turnkey real estate provider for 14 years with a stellar reputation and an A+ rating with the Better Business Bureau. Owner Terry Kerr was born and raised in Memphis. Yeah, he knows the market and has renovated and sold over 1,000 houses in the Memphis area. Find out what their many repeat buyers already know. Their houses are completely renovated, even come with a 1-year builder's warranty and a lifelong rental guarantee. They're a perfect fit for the first-time out-of-state investor or the seasoned investor diversifying their portfolio. Mid-South Homebuyers' friendly staff makes investing easy. Learn more at midsouthhomebuyers.com or give them a call at 901-217-HOME. The preceding program was brought to you by your home for wealth building, GetRichEducation.com.